Good morning. Thank you very much for coming today. My name's Colin Fraser, as it says on screen quite helpfully, but I've been very lucky to be involved with Jacobite art and artefacts, relics and antiques, however you want to call them. People come to these in a different way, they come to it with a different interest, but I think what's very important is, for me at least, being part of that journey, is perhaps finding these things in collections, rediscovering them, or indeed just being part of that story of preserving them, bringing them to a new home and finding them their rightful place. And that, I think, is one of the key things as we go forward, is their rightful place and their rightful history. I think no matter how long we are part of an object's story, it's extremely important that we record what we know, we put that down on paper, and we preserve that for the next generation. Too often, I could speak with many people in the room and other museums and collectors about what we don't know rather than what we do know. How is it possible that an object of great interest or great importance has no history to it at all? And it's a great shame, and lots of ones that David spoke about had real long provenances, and some just appear out of nowhere in great surprise. I think that's a really key point. So when we look at Jacobite art, we see it in collections, we see it in museums, we see it in auctions. The story is not always about the object itself. No one could say all these Jacobite glasses are the same. You know, they all have a different story to tell, where it's different iconography, it's different dates, it's different origins, it's different provenance. And it's digging down more deeply into that I think gives us the most understanding, the most interest, and the most excitement for these objects, and creates the power that David spoke about in many, many different ways. Again, I'm only ever a short part of these objects' life. I'm either helping a collector or bringing it to a new collector or a museum, and I think it's a great privilege. And it's, for my interest, being a small part of that journey, that object's journey, is fantastic fun. And seeing some things that had passed through hands on David's slides was a great privilege. So taking this slide, for example, when we talk about Jacobite art and antiques, it can come in so many forms. We have portraits around us, we've seen arms and armour, we've seen glass, we've seen jewellery, we've seen manuscripts, we can see tartan, we can see so many different things. And it's extrapolating those stories that is quite important. This slide perhaps gives the idea that Jacobite jewellery is quite common. Everything on this slide has some Jacobite connection, some very strong, some more passing. But what's key with this slide is only the two pieces on the bottom right and left hand corners could be said to be of 1715 to 1745 period. The two pieces in the middle have mid-18th century aspects to them, but are made slightly later, and the top arc are still true Jacobite pieces, but made in a much later date. And again, this is one of the key things when looking at Jacobite pieces, is putting them in their context of a date. The Jacobite period does not happen in 1745 to 1746. It's that much longer story. And the end point is arguable. Nobody will have a fixed point of ending, and the fact we're all here says it still carries on with interest. So saying Jacobite jewellery is common is a mistake, but saying that 18th century Jacobite jewellery is rare would certainly be fair. I thought I'd focus on something that was quite an iconic piece of mid-18th century Jacobite jewellery, which is the Four Peers ring. This is one of the few pieces of Jacobite jewellery that we can date confidently. It has to date after 1746, not only because the date's on there, but because what it's commemorating. By the provenance we know of it, it dates very closely to that period, which is fascinating. And it tells us a huge number of stories. And I think one of the key things is looking at a full-size portrait gives us a real enigmatic and powerful image, but small objects can tell us big and, in fact, perhaps a wider story as well. So it's a wonderful thing. This is not a new discovery. I've titled my talk New Discoveries and Rediscoveries. So I'm classing this as a rediscovery. These have been known and discussed since the early 1900s. There was an article done by Stevenson, who was the keeper of the National Museum, its earlier incarnation at that point, discussing Jacobite rings, bringing in the one David showed as well, bringing in the Four Peers ring, and the knowledge was fantastic at the time. Not spoil that quite yet. They were really well understood, but at that point the only real knowledge that's changed, I would say, is that they assumed at that point there were three. The British Museum has since acquired or discovered in their stores a fourth one, and there is another one. But what does this ring tell us? And I think the most important thing is not to overlook the shank of the ring rather than the head of the ring, as you're seeing here. This is commemorating the Four Peers, who we'll come to later, but the shank of the ring tells us as much about the period and the people. And that's one of the key things. It's not just commemorating the highest echelons of society, it's not commemorating just the four peers or the Stuarts themselves. This talks about actual people who may be more comparable to ourselves in that mid-18th century. It really concentrates quite heavily on the Manchester Regiment. This is a ring that is commemorating those who gave their lives, who were hung, drawn and quartered, executed at London over various executions. I think 3 or 4 executions across 46. All are commemorated on there. Just off screen here, you can unfortunately see the sort of severed head, equally gruesome as this one, of Townley, Francis Townley and George Fletcher, who raised the Manchester Regiment. Townley was obviously a character. There's great discussion whether he was asked to raise this regiment. He had escaped from the Hanoverian grasps after being captured at Gladsmuir and decided upon himself to create this regiment. There's lots of different stories about the real detail, but certainly with his mistress and a drummer, decided to go into Manchester and wildly created this havoc, basically, to create a regiment. There are different reports. Some say he had 30 men sign up, some say 800. So the success is varied, but certainly he was quite a man. I don't do much reading off slides, so don't worry, there's not many words on this, but this bears reading. Within an hour of his arrival, this is talking about Francis Townley, he began to beat up for recruits. The populace did not at first interrupt him, conceiving that the whole army was near the town. Remember, it's him, a drummer, and his mistress. What his wife thought isn't recorded. They surrounded him in a tumultuous manner with the intention of taking him prisoner. Dixon presented his blunderbuss, which was charged with slugs, threatening to blow out the brains of those who first dared to lay hands on himself or the 2 who accompanied him, and by turning around continually, facing in all directions and behaving like a lion. So this is a real powerful man. Again, we talk about people, and people is the key. A lot of the stories I'll talk about come back to people. Objects are fantastic. These are the windows into the people, whether it's a portrait or it's the blunderbuss that David spoke about or a ring. It goes on obviously to talk about the 4 peers, and I think this is quite interesting as well. These are arguably the highest ranked members of society who gave their life. We've got Charles Radcliffe, in fact, didn't make it to the 45. He'd escaped after the 15. He had been heavily involved, got to France, had been involved with the planning and the support and the funding for the 45. He and his son had gone the ship, it was Esperance that was captured by Sheerness with troops and with arms and with money for the cause, and were put straight into the Tower of London. He was retried for his part in the 15. He was and escaping thereafter, and retried for the part he would have taken part of in the 45, and suffered the fate of the heads on of getting his head cut off. Certainly. Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, no relation. I put that in every talk because he was a pretty horrible chap by all accounts. Doesn't seem to have been much redeeming feature. He was not a committed Jacobite, one could argue. He flip-flopped around. He's seen as being petitioning George for a dukedom. Charles seems to agree to give him a dukedom if he takes part, and that's the side he chooses. I think forced niece to marry him at one point to get land and property, then declared he wasn't married to her but tried to keep the land. So this side of the Frasers are of no great repute, so we certainly distance ourselves from that side. More local connection, we've got Kilmarnock and we've got Balmerino here. Just touching on Balmerino, this is a true Jacobite, and on the scaffold was quoted as saying, "O Almighty God, I humbly beseech thee to bless the King, the Prince and the Duke of York, and the dutiful branches of the royal family. Endue them with the Holy Spirit, enrich them with them thy heavenly grace, prosper them with all happiness, and bring them to thine everlasting goodness. All my benefaction, the faithful adherence to the cause for which I am about to suffer," and as we see here, suffers that final moment. So a true Jacobite through and through. We get to Kilmarnock, who obviously a local man, so I should be careful what I say, but certainly is quoted as saying, "For the 2 kings and their rights I cared not a farthing which prevailed, but I was starving, and by God, if Muhammad had set up his standard in the Highlands, I'd have been a good Muslim for bread, and stuck close to the party, for I must eat." So we all come to this in a different way. Certainly the highs and lows of the house certainly perhaps show he hadn't had the easiest time. But it's very interesting, he talks about must eat, and this is one of the great objects which unfortunately just out of shot here is the logo for the Battle of Falkirk Muir. This is a piece which you'll see this logo appear a few times. These are pieces that are already within the collection that will be on display once we get this fantastic battlefield museum open. This is the quaich that he ate his last meal from. This is a fantastic piece of Scottish silver made by William Clark of Glasgow, who was a very, very good maker of the period, made some fantastic quaichs. This is arguably one of the best that survives. Great provenance. Again, it goes back to the 1890s auction with full provenance back to Kilmarnock, and then into even a wonderful collection in the late 2000s of John Hyman, American collector, who's most of his collection now in Colonial Williamsburg, and I think some in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So not only do we have the Four Piers ring that tells us who this man was, we have the engravings of the man, we can look him in the eye, so to speak, and we know his sentiment, but here we can illustrate that with an object, which I think is fantastic. This was a bit of a discovery. The chap who had it had bought it very quietly from John Hyman. Its provenance was well recorded, and we knew of it, but it just appeared by chance into auction in 2015, I believe. But when we talk about the Four Piers ring, we should also talk about who made it. David's touched on Ebenezer Oliphant already. I decided I would probably lose the battle of showing the canteen as I was second in the line, so I've gone with the tea services. Ebenezer Oliphant is a very important goldsmith in Edinburgh. He has a very political career as well. Round about the 45, there are two very big factions within the Goldsmiths of Edinburgh and the trade body, the Incorporation of Goldsmiths, those who support and those who don't. Some are thrown out of the incorporation. When they swear the toast to the king, they're all mumbling under their breath, the true king, and these sorts of things. And if you weren't a member of the incorporation, you couldn't trade in Edinburgh. It was very much a closed shop. And David's point about why is the canteen marked by Ebenezer Oliphant is a very interesting one, in that it would be obvious. That mark is registered. If it was found and it was known what it was, it could be traced back to the maker, and he would be in great trouble, frankly, as David said. I think the answer in that instance is possibly, likely, we could debate this to the end of days, that because it was a commission, it was commissioned by somebody who knew what they were commissioning, knew why they were commissioning it, and more importantly, they knew who they were going to have it made in Oliphant as a true Jacobite maker. They felt confident in doing that. Also, the decoration could arguably have been put on after it was hallmarked, because that doesn't affect the legality of hallmarking. Therefore, when it was hallmarked, it was just a plain canteen. Then when it was presented, it's what David showed, and it's so magical. But why Oliphant? We say he's a true Jacobite. Why Oliphant? He is the nephew to Lord Gask, Oliphant of Gask. He is the nephew to the Laird. He is also the cousin of Lawrence Oliphant, who's Bonnie Prince Charlie's aide-de-camp, and who escapes after 45. He is seen working for Jacobites. A lot of the silver we see, which none of these unfortunately, but some of it is engraved with armorials, there is that connection. He's an obvious choice to make the ring. This is where David and I should have told David this. We're going to slightly disagree on one of David's slides, and we agree, but we slightly disagree. We talk about Adam Tate being the maker of the ring, and I agree with David entirely that this bit is made by Adam Tate. That's very well known, but I think that we have to look at it in a bit more of a wider sense. And when we look at these pieces of jewellery and Jacobite relics, we have to start with what we know. And where can we begin factually? Because there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of want, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of romanticism tied to these things sometimes. So we just have to look at them. This is a fantastic ring, which again, just out of shot, we have the Falkirk logo to my right. It's a great piece, recent discovery. While it may look familiar to lots of people because of the portrait in the centre here, there are factors here we need to go into to try and understand this discovery. So we have three rings in front of us here. We have the National Museum one in the centre, and we have the new one here, and a second very similar here. There are lots of obvious connections to these, but there are lots of differences. We must remember that just because the medallions are made by the same person doesn't mean the ring is made by the same person. We have to look at why is it made and when is it made. As David says, the portrait is based on the bust, the Lamone bust, a fantastically successful sculptor in France in the mid-18th century. It's commissioned directly by Charles on his return after the failure of the 45. He is quoted as saying it's as good a likeness as there has been. He's very pleased with the likeness. We therefore can assume he has probably commissioned these medallions directly. He would have known Adam Tate. Adam Tate was part of the Jacobite army, escapes after Culloden. Lamone is recognised again as making garden statuary and busts for the French royal family, the Palace of Versailles, much wider French aristocracy as well, so an obvious choice. So again, you understanding why and from whom these things are commissioned gives a thought process of what's going on. We also know these medallions are existing by 1750. It makes sense, they can't exist before the bust exists because it can't be copied from something that hasn't been made yet. In 1750, Pickles the spy It says, an officer of Ogilvy's regiment, this is writing back to, this is from France to Pickles, is talking of a small quantity of coloured glass seals with the pretender's son's effigy, and also a small head made of silver gilt about his bigness is a bit obscure. I assume that is meant to be likeness, to be set in rings. So we know these are leaving France as medallions to be set into rings, but also I think we can say that they wouldn't have been made in France and not put into rings. There's a great Stuart court there, there's a great Stuart support, a lot of exiled people there. So again, we look at these things and we think, well, we've got different aspects to pick on here. We've got lots of designs that are similar and lots of designs that are slightly different. So if we look at the Four Piers ring, here, this is the National Museum portrait ring, and this is another whose provenance wasn't recorded, but was written up in the 1925 Society of Antiquaries article by Stevenson of the National Museum, just called Jacobite Rings. We see lots of common factors. Now, I firmly believe, and I don't think anyone disagrees with me, and certainly lots of people do seem to agree, that the Four Piers ring is by Ebenezer Oliphant. If we take that as a definite, it's made for his family, that would be who they commission it from. In 46, 47, 48, he's going to be the only person in Edinburgh you could trust to have this overtly Jacobite piece made. So we look at that, we've got the thistle, we've got the rose, and we see that on the National Museum ring, and the other one, the catalogue, and we've got this intertwined shank with all the different Jacobite motto on the NMS ring, and the members of the Manchester Regiment, the officers, Four Piers, etc. So this is all very obvious, this is all very comparable. Looking at it, how it's made stylistically, it's made the same way. And again, we can see that looking at the rings and taking the ruins there. But the Adam Tate ring, as I'm attributing it to France, doesn't have that. We have on the shoulders a fleur-de-lis, which I've tried to show the right way up here. And I must say, this ring was a very new discovery, so you must excuse the pretty ropey photographs. This is only turned up in the last couple of months. That fleur-de-lis is quite telling. Fleur-de-lis is a very French symbol, as we know. It's a very Catholic symbol. It is used in relation to saints. It's used in French royalty. It's used in divine right. So again, quite important. We look at the ring again. We've got diamonds. Diamonds at this point in the mid-18th century only come from India. The South African mines that Cecil Rhodes discovered in the 1840s haven't been found for generations. Diamonds are extremely, extremely expensive. These are arguably very high-quality diamonds. Doesn't come across in the photo terribly well, but quite important, expensive material at the time. In the back of the ring, we have the initial CPR for Charles Prince Regent, or Carlos Principus Rex, however you want to extrapolate that out. Very similarly done to the ring of James that David showed as well, and a lock of hair set within the locket. So for a ring, for a medallion, to leave Paris in 1748 to 1750, let's argue, without a lock of hair, how does the lock of hair find the medallion in Edinburgh to be by Ebenezer Oliphant? I think that doesn't work. This says to me this is made closely to Charles. Also, the motto is by merit, by right, with Charles's head in the middle. That's a very personal motto, I would argue. It's not a standard Jacobite motto that you might see on other pieces, whether it be snuff boxes, medallions, glassware, that sort of thing. So again, it's different. And just before I go to the next slide, the other interesting point is it fits my finger. I've not got the fattest of fingers, but certainly rather sausage-like. So it's a large ring, it's man's ring as well, which is key for a second. What's tantalising is in 1923, Helen Farquharson, who was with the British Museum and wrote a lot of articles on Jacobite medallions, wrote an article using the British Museum's medalette, but wrote an article talking about a ring with that medalette, with that medallion being given to James by Charles from Paris in that period. She records it being in a John Stuart's collection, get my Stuarts right here, and that it was going to be displayed in the West Highland Museum exhibition of 1925. This is why recording is important. Unfortunately, Helen Farquharson was obsessed with medallions. If that medallion had been set into the bonnet of a gold Rolls Royce with a unicorn on top, she wouldn't have mentioned that. All she'd have mentioned was the medallion. She doesn't mention the ring at all, other than that. West Highland Museum, whether they were working to a page number system or whatever, their cataloguing of the said ring, item 139, Ring of King James VIII, lent by John Stuart. No descriptor at all. So unfortunately, I can't say that this ring was from Charles to James. That's impossible. That piece of information hasn't surfaced, if in fact indeed it exists. But I think when we take into account that we know that stylistically from the manufacturer it is more of a French style made than a an Edinburgh style. It doesn't fit that Ebenezer Oliphant style of ring with the intertwining and the rose and the thistle, which is quite standard for him, and is seen across other pieces attributed to him as well. The diamonds raise the quality as well. The lock of hair raises the quality. The motto, to my mind, and if anyone's heard this motto elsewhere, I'd love to hear, because it will either help me one way to prove it or disprove it. It's impossible to say it is, but it's made at a time where Charles and Adam Tate are in the same place. It's made to a quality and it's made to a size. It could well be. We will keep looking for that missing piece of information. We talk about discovery and rediscovery, and I think with modern research, and lots of people in the room have done far more academic research than I have and gone to source material and whatnot, it's a fantastic skill to have. And I think we must be very careful with modern research. People who come to me with things sometimes have done their research to prove what they want it to be. They want to prove that this watch could have belonged to Bonnie Prince Charlie. Well, it didn't, because it's got a battery in it. But they want to prove it did because it says CPR on the back. And they look to prove what they want rather than look to prove what the object tells them. Google is the problem. You ask Google the question you want to find the answer to. You don't ask Google, what do you think? So we have to look in all these different places. And that was very interesting. Now, I would argue that this little piece of silver doesn't look terribly exciting on screen. It's about 40 mil, 4 centimetres, it's about this size. It weighs 6 grams, so less than the same as a 2p coin, so it kind of blows up quite nicely though. This, I think, is one of the greatest discoveries that I've been involved in the last 4 or 5 years, or longer, frankly. And it was fantastic. This is a piece that is small, it's silver, it's not marked. But what is it? Any ideas from the audience? We're looking at it, I'm seeing sort of squinted eyes and whatnot. Any idea what it could be? Stand aside, let the gentleman to my left. So we've got the initial CP here. Here's a slight clue. We've got the Prince of Wales feathers, we've seen that already. And we've got a date 1745 there, which is a bit smudged. Again, quite a new discovery, and again, a terrible photo, so forgive me. The reverse gives us no clue. It's just plain, it's scruffy, very heavily tarnished. We've got a few little locating pins, means it must have been set into something. But what is it? The question is, I'm not entirely sure. I know where it can connect to, and I know where we can take it, and I know the story that it can tell us in part. And that takes us to here. This takes us to April 1746, this takes us to Inverness, this connects us with Robert Strange. Robert Strange is an engraver from Edinburgh. He's well known to us, we'll see some other examples of his work shortly. It is taking us to Inverness, where we have a banknote plate that is commissioned directly by Prince Charles. They've lost a ship full of money and gold coming from France to fund the rebellion or fund the uprising, again, depending which side of the fence you want to be on. And he has this commission. When you look at the two pieces side by side now, you can see Prince of Wales feathers here, you've got the little thistle, you've got this kink, and all these segments as well, and the initials. Now, I would argue these two things are the same. These two things are, one is inspiring the other, or one is copied from the other. Therefore, we've all of a sudden taken this piece to 1746. We've taken it to Inverness. We've taken it to be beside Charles. Now, what does that tell us? Again, this is very clumsy graphics, because this is not my strong point, but when you overlay the two, I've tried to make them roughly the same size. Proportionally, they match. When you make them the same size, they basically fit over each other. This is a fascinating thing, so what can we tell us? Robert Strange is a name we all know. This is the portrait that perhaps is one of the most prolific Jacobite portraits of the period. It's argued it's done from life, or it's copied from the Ramsay one that was done from life that was recently rediscovered. It's certainly done at the period, which is the point. He did the martyrs' roses here, which some would argue are the tickets to the ball of in Holyrood, which doesn't seem to make much sense because the dates are a bit later, but certainly he is there at the time. He is following the Jacobite cause. It's recorded that Prince Charles calls him to have 2 personal meetings about the banknotes being in the banknote plate. Is it feasible? Can it be done? Can he do it? There are problems. Is there a printing press in Inverness that can do it? Is there access to copper? All these things. But we know it survives because we have the banknote plate. The banknote plate is extremely well recorded, it's extremely well written up, and its provenance is unquestionable. So I think what we can say here is that these pieces have to be in the same place at the same time. The Prince commissions this directly. He has meetings with Robert Strange before Colin. They don't get printed, as we know. But for for the detail to be so similar and so identical, it has to have been in the same place at the same time. This is not a standard cartouche you would see on other things. The fact that the feathers are kilted off to one side, that this will come in from the edge as well, is fascinating. My argument would therefore be that this piece of silver inspires the banknotes. This piece of silver is what Bonnie Prince Charlie gives to Robert Strange, saying, that's what I want on my banknotes. These are not banknotes. I've used that term 10 times and it's wrong every time. These are promissory notes. These are him guaranteeing to pay. It's recorded in Strange's memoirs that these banknotes would be redeemable on victory. This is Charles saying, I can't give you the gold you want, but I will. We will win, you will get what you want. I will be my father will be on the throne. So what else would you put on these banknotes other than your signature, your right, your heraldic emblems that say who is guaranteeing this mine, to give it any credibility. So if we take that a step further back, that would suggest that this piece of silver is on something that Charles has about his person. It suggests that it's probably it could have come from France, it could have come from Italy, it could have arguably been at Glenfinnan, got as far south as Derby, rested in Holyrood for a bit, got to Inverness and been with Charles the whole time. This is as important as the canteen, or as important as the Amen glasses. This is the most personally connected piece I can think of. What was it on? I still don't have that answer. I would argue that it's been on something perishable, a natural material, whether it's been the wooden stock of a gun butt, whether it's been a tortoiseshell snuff mull, whether it's been an ivory snuff mull, whether it's been a leather attaché case, but something personal that's with Charles. To give it to Robert Strange and say, this is what I want, tells us that it's important to him. Thankfully, lots of people do agree with me, because it's a bit out there if you don't agree with me. It was recently written up, this was the banknote plate that was done to, the modern print from the plate, I should say, that was done to help fund the West Highland Museum regeneration and expansion. The booklet they have just produced, which I believe is now available online for £3.95 or £4, is available from their website, and that includes the cartouche and argues that, again, this comes before the banknote. The plate disappears from 46 until much later. It's not been inspired in a latter period. And equally, someone said to me, I bought about the silver, Colin. Surely you could tell how old the silver is. And thankfully, it's not an easy thing to do, but the Assay Office in Edinburgh, the only place in Scotland that is legally able to test and hallmark silver, have tested the silver through X-ray fluorescence spectrographic testing, which basically means you shoot a laser at it, the laser bounces back and tells you exactly what the silver is made of, and all the silver that's in there is of a quality that would be mid-18th century or thereabouts. There are nothing in the solder, there's nothing in the makeup of the silver that would put it later. So again, while it doesn't guarantee it's that period, it certainly helps get us there. I knew I was going to run out of time, and I probably have, because I rarely use two words when I can find five that'll fit the same sentence. So I thought David and I ending on a similar slide was perfect, which is just serendipitous. I think we talk about rare objects, we talk about research, we talk about understanding. I agree with David, these glasses are just exceptional. They're variously discussed as there are at least 8 or 12 that were made or known to be in the dinners in 1787-88. I know of 3. And these are those. One in the National Museum, one in the Grand Beauty Collection, and one now within the Falkirk Museum. So, or will be in the museum instead of within the trust. There is research to be done on these. There's always a story to tell, there's always a story to learn. So hopefully this will be the next talk that David and I can come up with something interesting to say. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. Hopefully I've covered things you didn't know, and maybe you've got some questions or some ideas, and hopefully someone can tell me that motto is definitely Charles's, signed off to his father all his letters, and we can tie that ring back to him. But thank you very much indeed. If there's any questions, do just shout, otherwise I shall hand it back to Roddy. Answered everything you want to know about Jacobites in half an hour. Fantastic.